Well, hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Artist Talk. We're joined by three MFA artists at the Ulster University, Claire French, Paul Greenfield, and Martin Reynolds. This talk is in conjunction with the Lightness of Touch exhibition currently at Belfast Exposed Gallery 2. It's currently running until the 17th of July. So if anyone is in the call currently has not seen it, please make your way down to Belfast Exposed before then. Some fantastic pieces of work on display. Just a little house rules in terms of the Zoom. If everyone could mute themselves when presenting, just so that the artists can talk about their work. Thank you for that. And if any questions, Q&A, that will take place at the end. So if anyone has questions, please put that in the chat on the right-hand side, or perhaps at the bottom if you cannot find it. And I'll get to those questions in due course. First person to present is Paul. Are you ready, Paul, to share your screen?
Yeah, I am. Yeah.
Please feel free.
I'm just going to share screen. Advance portion of the screen. Share. Okay, can you see the bike?
We can indeed, Paul. It's great.
Good. All right. Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Paul Greenfield. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody at BX, Deirdre, Mark, Ben, for organising the event today, and thank the rest of you for spending time listening to us talking about our work. I'm going to talk about my self-made project, which I've been working on as part of my recently completed MFA, as Ben said, at Ulster University. And before going any further, actually, I'd like to say that I wholeheartedly recommend this degree to anyone thinking of pursuing their postgraduate photographic studies. The teaching staff are not just academics, as they are in many on many photographic degrees. These are practicing photographers, and amazing photographers, actually. And under Ken Grant, who's the course director, they've put together an amazing course. It's been the most enjoyable 2 years for me for a long time, and I've learned so much from it. So self-made is about my generation. You can probably see from the screen earlier that I am a baby boomer. So we're going to be talking about my generation. Get the next slide. I don't want to delve into too much history, but it is important to understand the circumstances that gave rise to the baby boomers. Firstly, the name comes from the boom in the number of babies being born. In 1963, for example, over 1 million babies were born, and that number's never been surpassed. So we arrived on the scene just after the Second World War, between 1945 and 1965, to parents that had lived through food rationing and a permanent state of worry about the future. It's hardly surprising that they wanted their children to have a better life. And it was made clear to us that education followed by financial success was the key to future happiness. And the spirit of this Philip Roth quote from American Pastoral is very recognizable to me. I've only put a bit of the quote up there because I didn't want to distract you, but I'll read you the whole quote. There was the neighborhood, the communal determination that we, the children, should escape poverty, ignorance, disease, social injury, and intimidation. Escape, above all, insignificance. You must not come to nothing. Make something of yourselves. There was a big belief in life, and we were steered relentlessly in the direction of success. A better existence was going to be ours. So I and my contemporaries, we entered the workplace just as the new technology-based industries arrived. And with globalization, the world was very much our oyster. Very soon, rampant inflation caused house prices to rocket, and the cost of the mortgages we had became trivial. And we're talking, today the government worries when we get 2 or 3% inflation. In 1974, we had 24% inflation. And for the 5 years around that, it was high double digits. So this, along with government policy, rising stock markets, index-linked pensions, completed the picture. And I don't want to say all of us are wealthy, because that's clearly not true, but relative to our parents, we became wealthy. And in 2019, I read this quote in the Times by Hannah Betts, who I like very much. I think she's a great journalist. But it was to do with free TV licenses. The government was talking about giving us free TV licenses. And she said, I hated them as a child in the 1970s, repulsed by individuals so keen to impress upon everyone their revolutionary cool while sporting flared jeans. I hated them as a teenager in the 1980s, when they were embodied by types such as Richard Branson and Anita Roddick, whose zeal for changing the world felt less obvious than the magnitude of their egotism. And I really hated them in the 1990s, when I realized they'd left 20-something Gen Xers, such as myself, with their mess to clear up, while saddling us with recession and McJobs. My God, when I read that, that was the first time that I'd seen the phrase baby boomer mean something other than a booming baby. And I realized then that a lot of people in the younger generations viewed us with disdain, and that the phrase baby boomer was being used to describe something completely different. A group of people who were enjoying booming wealth. Shortly afterwards, I started at Belfast School of Art, and at my interview, I had a very clear context for my practical work. I would document some friends and family from my generation in order to give an insight into the lives of the boomers. Once I started research for my project, I found many books in print that had a common theme, that my generation has somehow taken away the future of our children and our grandchildren. And you can see some of the titles here. I won't read these out to you, but a generation of sociopaths, how we betrayed America, stole the future, took the children's future, what did they ever do for us? So as part of my research, I just found, a huge amount of literature on what a dreadful generation I'm part of. Now, when we look at images of people in their surroundings, it's easy for us to employ unconscious bias, which will shape our opinions about what we're seeing. At the university, we were taught a lot about semiology, or the use of signs and signals in images. And I'm going to show you several photographs. The interpretation is intended to be highly ambiguous. I want you to be a bit confused about what I'm saying. And I want overall to prompt a debate and a discussion. Have we simply taken advantage of the prevailing conditions, or have we knowingly impoverished the lives of future generations? And just hold this thought that my work has been described as people who have everything but nothing, and nothing but everything. So I'll show you a few images, and we'll see how that relates to what I've been saying. This image provokes a lot of questions. At first glance, this family might appear to be wealthy, but his genes might indicate something else to you. Is the expensive house really the treasure this couple have pursued? Or is it the joy of spending time together as a family? In this image, I want to show you the juxtaposition of the family's treasure in the previous image with that of a mudlarker looking for discarded objects in the river. A different kind of treasure, particularly when sat in front of the City of London, home to billions of dollars worth of financial assets. And here he is again, Steve. He's surrounded by his treasure. Some of it's come from the river, and a lot of it he's just collected. But he knows the provenance of every one of those things that you can see there. And he'll spend hours telling you about how they used to make signposts in the last century that were made from, certain types of metals. And so his treasure is something completely different to the guy sitting in his very expensive North London home. Is this baby boomer, is she lonely in her expensive home? Or is she happy with her own company? She likes, obviously, to play, from what we can see, she likes musical instruments, plays the piano as a singleton activity, plays the sax, singleton activity, clearly very musical, clearly lives in a very expensive place. And I have to tell you that, of course, my images are constructed to a certain extent. It would be nice to be a fly on the wall and to be able to take pictures without the subjects knowing. But like many photographers, what we're trying to do is recreate a message in our work. We want this message to be, we don't want this image to be obvious. We want it to ask questions, which I hope that does. This one is, there's no baby boomers here. There's a couple on the table there's lots of couples in the room, actually. There's 8 couples if you include the dummies and their reflections. But this clearly is a home, it's full of expensive art and furniture. All those flowers indicate it might have come from the hippies, some flower power in that image. Is it flashy or is it contemporary? What sort of people live here? Do they have children? There's no photographs of family on display. There is a dinner table set for 8 people, so we can assume that they're used to entertaining. The wine is unopened. So again, there's a lot of semiotics in this image. And it may be this is the type of image that would provoke ill feeling in some of the people that we were talking about earlier on. This is another boomer, he's another mudlarker. I think there's something fascinating about people. They've done this for hundreds of years, since Elizabethan times. The Thames was the dustbin. And if you walk along to Greenwich, you'll see people like this looking for discarded items. And they find like children's shoes from Henry VIII's time, tankards, spoons, coins. Because the river is unique in that it's got a tide. And so this stuff just gets brought in and they know where to look for it as well. The tide leaves lines in the sand further along at Greenwich. And in fact, Steve, the guy I spoke to earlier, mentioned earlier, he found an 11th century coin in the river, which he had to hand over to the British Museum. But does this guy have nothing or everything? Here's our couple, again, from their expensive North London home. They seem to have everything, don't they? They're surrounded by wealth. But are they happy or are they sad? Who knows? And finally, another baby boomer who appears to have everything. Perhaps he and the others I've shown you today have made themselves, in a deeper sense, over a lifetime of experience and development. In summary, I hope you will have gained an insight into the lives of some of these boomers. Whilst I neither criticise or justify the apparent actions of an entire generation, I do want to provoke the discussion. What is the real treasure in our lives? Were our parents wrong when they steered us towards material wealth as a contributor to happiness? Thank you. So that's my work.
That's great, Paul. Thank you so much for sharing that. Definitely some thought-provoking questions will come later today. Claire, would you like to share next? Oh, you're on mute, Claire, sorry. See your screen. Yep. You're still on mute though, Claire.
Sorry, I had to stop sharing my screen too.
No, it's all right. I hear you now. Perfect.
Okay, I'm back to sharing screen. Why is he not doing it now? Is that sharing now?
That's perfect, Claire. Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay. Okay, if I move that on, is that move? Yes, that's moving. Excellent. Yep. Okay. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of my background and then a little bit about my work and obviously essentially about the project that I've done for my MFA at Ulster. So just a little bit of personal history. I've always liked having a camera in my hand, although if you look at this, I was perfecting the Instagram pout long before it actually became a thing. So at age 8, I got my first Polaroid, and basically as a child, I think it was mostly about recording things around me. There was no reasoning behind it. It was just moments that I didn't want to forget. I've always had a fear of forgetting things. So my camera was with me all the time, mostly to record things that I wanted to remember for posterity. And then later on, I went to university and it was the same thing. I just wanted to document the stuff around me. And at the time I was studying English literature. And I think that gave me my love of stories, which I've brought through with me. I've always had an interest in narratives. I've also spent time studying psychology, and sort of people and stories absolutely fascinate me, which is what I think brought me on to photography. Sort of taking snapshots wasn't eventually enough. And at the age of 31, I went on and signed up for my A level at my local college. And it started to open up a whole new world to me. I started to think about photography in a very different way, about learning to read visual imagery and about trying to tell a story with my photography. After my A level, I was mostly self-taught. I began by doing a lot of street photography, which, as you can see here, still involved a lot of books. But I learned how to research the work of other photographers and use them for inspiration. And I learned about wanting to tell a story, which then led me to my first big project whilst I was still teaching myself. And I did a personal series, Internal Voices, which is a 365-day self-portrait project, which was essentially focusing on identity and mental health. And going through this, I realised that I wanted to sort of learn more about my photography and my practice and gain more consistency and insight into it, which is what essentially led me to apply for my MFA at Belfast. And I'll reiterate what Paul said. It's been absolutely life-changing in lots of ways, and the course has been amazing. The lecturers have been wonderful, very supportive. They've helped us find our pathways without leading us there. And I've met some great people on the course, and sort of my fellow photographers have been brilliant. The support that we've gained as a group has been wonderful. And I think it's taken my photography to a new level, and I've learned a lot more about how I practice and what it is I want to say with my work. So when I started my MFA, my initial thought about the project was initially a story about my family home, my father's home. My dad bought this house when I was about 19, and it was the first house that we'd had as a family home since my mum and dad got divorced, and that my dad, my brother and I had lived in together since I was 8 years old. And my dad had decided that it was time to sell this house, this place that had been my safe space for about 28 years. And it brought up all sorts of emotions. And I think at the time I just realised that I needed to document it. I wasn't sure how or why, but I needed to document it. Swan song for posterity. Again, it's that idea of not wanting to forget and to keep hold of memories. It's obviously got a lot of emotional history tied up in it. It was the place that my husband and I got married. It was our first home together when we first lived together. Lots of family memories had gone through there. But I was also conscious that the house had gone through a cycle. It was originally bought as a very neglected repossession. And then as a family, and my father had loved and tended and brought it back to life, but then he lost his motivation, lots of things had happened, and it was again falling into neglect. And it was like the house had gone on this full circle of life. I think one of the first phrases when I was first researching was a piece that we read by Colm Tobin, who said that houses are always full of faded hope. The house had been a childhood dream of my father's, and it represented a house that he saw every day on his way to school. And he saw that as his idea of success, really. But even though that had been achieved, his dreams are different now, but he was still struggling to let go of the emotional attachment that's tied up in it, because there's so many family memories. And these family memories have been handed down to me, even though they're different. You know, there's generations of items within the house. There's stuff from my dad's a bit of a hoarder. And there's stuff from my grandma and my great grandma. There's stuff that's traveled. We lived in the Middle East. There's stuff that's traveled across continents with us, and it's all still there, or it was all still there in the house. And you know, these family memories are together with the place and the possessions of my father's difficulty letting go of them. Also, I think mirrored my own feelings of difficulty of letting go of my marriage, and the change in that relationship, and the change with the selling of the house and the relationship with my family, because the house had always been a conduit for everybody. It's the place we all came together. Everybody came through this house. So all of a sudden, everything in my life was changing. So I began the project by just spending time in there and looking through archival family photos. So, you know, there was a lot of correlation between things that were in archival family photos and the items that were in my dad's house, which again, I'll come to again shortly. Initially, when I began the house, because it was sort of the changing of everything that I knew, and also the ending of the marriage, I think initially everything that I saw was the way it was falling apart and had been disintegrated. And I was concentrating on all the little bits, you know, the things that were fraying at the edges and the bits that were being patched up and hadn't been repaired properly. But as I spent more time there and I was reflecting more, it allowed me to open up to remember sort of the happy times that there, the relationships that had been built, the way people had moved. And it gave me more avenues of research and reflection. And alongside this, I think harking back to my love of literature, I spent a lot of time reading poetry whilst I was doing this, several of which had a great deal of influence on my thought process and the emotions around the whole project. So one of the collections was Profit and Loss by Leontia Flynn, whose book kind of sums up life's triumphs and failures. You know, it's profits and losses, it's the things we lose, the things we gain. And she does this by mentally walking through rooms of her past, which really resonated with what I was doing with my father's house. And in particular, this first poem in the book, The Dream House, particularly resonated with me, because this house was my father's childhood dream, and the idyllic title versus the imagery of the tired house showing signs of a life lived, and paying homage to each loving grubby mark made by the previous inhabitants fitted really well with what I was trying to do with my work. And those poems are packed with a sense of transition, which is obviously what was happening with me. And it draws attention to all the ephemera that fills our lives, you know, all the little bits of things that we have left in drawers and the marks we make on our surroundings, and in turn, the marks that the surroundings make on us. A journalist, O'Malley, said that the book is all about human relationships, those that fail and those that succeed, and the detritus of everyday life left behind as people and places come and go, which was also very much struck at the heart of my work. And at the beginning, it was very much about finding these marks and layers of a life lived in the house, but also of that absence and lost and of things missing and ending. And one of the other poems that's had a massive influence on my work was The Four Quartets by T.S. Eliot. I came across it quite at the beginning of this. It wasn't something I was familiar with already, but the collection has absolutely resonated with me all the way through, and it's something that I keep coming back to constantly. The idea of time and memory is hugely resonant throughout this long work, and I'm not going to read any of it to you because I couldn't do it justice, but if anybody is interested, Jeremy Irons did a recording of this for the BBC, which is absolutely sublime, and I quite often go to sleep listening to it because it's just beautiful, the way that he projects it. You know, he talks about the way renewal and decay is not necessarily, it can be linear, it can be cyclical, and he has this cyclical thing. One of the poems starts with, in the end is my beginning, and at the end it's in the beginning, in the beginning is my end, and in my end is my beginning. And this whole idea that life is constantly recycling itself, the way things crumble, but they build back up again. And I think it was like this going through the house. It was like peeling back the layers of the history of our family, of my marriage, and trying to make sense of all those things and pulling it all back together. And it was actually an exercise in pre-mourning, really. I was given my dad had moved out of the house, and he's living in Spain now, and he sold it, so we had to clear it. And in this process, it gave me the opportunity to do something that for most people is only done after the death of a loved one. Whereas we got the opportunity to clear it out and ask questions. So it gave me a unique position on understanding of trying to place myself more in my family history. And with my father being a bit of a hoarder, there was also, this bottle of wine was from Sheffield in 1976, and these check stubs are from 1973. So, you know, there's a lot tied up within the house. And within my practice, I've used lots and lots of different approaches with this project. It's not just one single approach. So I've used quite a lot of self-portraiture photography, which I've done before, which is partially about me inserting myself into my own history, really, and that juxtaposition between past and present. But also one of my favourite photographers, Francesca Woodman, when she was asked about doing self-portrait photography, she also said it's also a matter of convenience because you're always there and you don't have to rely on anyone else. So it was a combination of the two. But I think mostly this whole idea of putting myself into my past and trying to kind of make sense of my present by doing that was key to this project. You know, sort of the way the light moves around the house and that whole idea of time as it moves around there was very important within it as well. And I also, one of the other techniques that I started to do was a process of rephotography. So again, another way of using archival images to blend the past and the present and try and bring those memories to the fore and try and understand them. So I've used this in several ways. And then you start to realise it's only sometimes afterwards when you're getting towards the end of the project that you start to see that there's themes or motifs that come through that you hadn't necessarily intended. So butterflies have always been of interest to me. I've got a couple tattooed on my arm, but I realised that not only were they, but because they've got this whole idea of representing change and transition and going through this difficult stage to come out as something more beautiful. And I realised that all the way through there's butterflies within this, but not only the butterflies themselves, but also representations of them that I was finding throughout the house, which I thought was really interesting. And again, this whole idea of the past and the present, and you can see in this one with the mix of it on the edges is the clutter that my father's collected over the years, going back into sort of the cleaner, fresher memories. And not just about, there's a lot in there about my marriage, but it's also about family and about the family times that we had together. All those things, what happens when the place and the objects go? The memories are still there, but we don't have the same way of triggering them. And I think that was part of what this project was about as well, was trying to have something that I could always go back to remember. And that whole idea of change and things breaking down now, and sort of the marks that we've left, going back to Leon Flynn's poem, the marks that we leave behind for someone else to understand. And then, as I said earlier, one of the other things that I've worked with is archival photos and then the objects. And in the end, the way it presented itself and the way it's shown in the book, I've taken the objects as they are now and done them in black and white, because it was a juxtaposition and a contrast to the colour archival photographs. And again, it's back to that idea of when these objects are on their own, what do they mean? It might trigger a memory for us, but for anybody else, it's just an object. It doesn't really mean anything. And sort of all these things, obviously the exhibition's on at Belfast Exposed, but I've got so much material. So now I'm still working on some of these. The house has gone now. So, but a lot of the sort of the archival work that I'm doing, I'm still working on it. And then hopefully towards the end of this year, I'll be making an artist book, and then I can do something with that and hopefully finally bring the project to fruition. And that's the end. Thank you for listening.
It's great. Thank you so much, Claire. That's really exciting news. Definitely we'll talk about that in the questions. If anyone still has any questions for the artist, please put them in the chat. Fantastic, Claire. Yes. So Martin, are you ready to share your screen?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Just trying to find my particular, there we go. Can you see that?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so first of all, thank you for allowing me to present this evening. And I would concur obviously with what both Claire and Paul have said about the experience of both working with Belfast Exposed and also with the tutorial teams at Belfast University. My project was Reversing Through the Rear View, Chapter 3. And what I seem to be, yeah, there we go. So what I was going to do is just give you a little bit of background, a little bit of personal background, a brief introduction to Reversing Through the Rear View, the methodology that I used in executing the project over the 2-year period, some examples of the work to put it into context, and then a little idea around what I'm planning for or hope will happen to the work once it's put out into the actual into the world. So I'm Irish. I've been based in London for 32 years now, so I'm mainly based here. I've come to photography quite late. I really started to take it up in earnest in 2012. Prior to that, I was working in a corporate background in analytics and market research, and I had set up my own company in 1999. The context of the work that I'm doing is that, or that I'm reflecting on, was that in 2008, I was diagnosed with cancer, and that set upon a series of changes which resulted in not only in the treatment, but also then with the selling of my business, the riding off into the sunset and traveling for as long as I did, which was up until 2018. And then finally finding out that actually I wasn't going to die from this particular illness. So I needed to do something. And it was in fact the MFA that came to the rescue and gave me the, I suppose, the stimulus and excitement to jump in and to do what I did. So I was a cancer sufferer, and now I'm a cancer survivor. So I don't appear to be, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I can hear you, Martin.
So Reversing Through the Rear View was obviously undertaken during the MFA. It evolved out of a desire to revisit some personal experiences and to resurface some emotions and feelings. Historically, when bad things had happened to me, what I tended to do was to put my head down, go very quickly through them, package them up neatly, and put them in the past. I never really reflected back historically on things. So in undertaking the MFA and assessing my photographic practice, I also determined to look at the way that I dealt with things emotionally and psychologically. And for this particular reason, I looked at the cancer experience. So I didn't really want to look at it in the context of the scientific and medical interventions that had happened. I wanted to look at it from a psychological, emotional, and feeling perspective, and to see whether I could learn anything from that experience. But just to give you some context, the actual interventions, and we won't focus on these too much, but just to give you a sense of how serious things were. So my neck snapped and I needed to have it stabilized. I was treated for multiple myeloma, which was chemotherapy. I had radiotherapy to kill a tumor, which was in the second bone right inside the skull of my head. So I could have been a quadriplegic had my neck snapped completely when it did. Fortunately, it didn't. And then I came into treatment at a time when they were starting to use stem cell transplants to reset the immune systems. So I was given an autologous stem cell transplant. That was namely my own cells harvested, taken out of me, and then given back to me at a period of time, which I never really understood. Because if your system is faulty and they take those cells and then give them back to you, how could it possibly reset things? But it did, and thankfully I can actually talk about it here today. So the duration of treatment was 1.5 years. This is the statement that I use to talk about the work, and really, I suppose what I would highlight about it is they're all self-portraitures. The majority of the work that I've generated over the past 2 years are self-portraitures. It's where I've put myself into the image, and historically I would have been shy to do some things like that. So I wanted to again challenge myself from that perspective also. Really, I suppose you could sum up my work in trying to answer this question. And this was Jo Spence, who for me is an absolute star and a hero in the historic photographic work that she's done. But the question was, how do you make leukemia visible? Well, how do you? And really what she was talking about was not what was happening on the physical surface, as a person. It was all the things that go on below the surface when you experience a trauma such as she did and I did. So in actually undertaking the project, as an output, what I managed to generate were a number of images, photographs, where photographs didn't actually satisfy my sense of what I wanted. I altered the images. Where that didn't work, I created drawings. And then finally, towards the end of year 2, out of the blue came a poem. So something that I wrote, which I'd never written before. So those 4 elements became I suppose, the cornerstones of how the work would be presented. And my idea of formats is that there are 90 pieces which basically formulate the work, which form into 23 panels, which would form part of an exhibition. I have a video which supports the work, and then I'm planning on a book at the end of the year, and I'll cover that in a little bit more detail towards the end. So the methodology that I used was really reflecting on an incident or an emotion or a feeling. And this is one of the first images that I generated, which set me on the path to generating further work. And what I would often do after generating it was to sit and reflect on it and to allow my emotions to basically evolve and come to the surface. And as a result of that, would then generate more images and reflect. So it was an iterative process that resulted in the generation of the work that you'll see in a couple of minutes. And I suppose really when I started to read, I've never been really academic historically. I tend to go and do things first and then find out who did them previously afterwards. So in looking at the type of work I was generating, I noted that I was really doing work similar to Jo Spence or to Hannah Wilkie, and probably even like living artists like Cristina Nunes, who's a Barcelona-based artist who does a lot of work in therapeutic photography. So my work is basically autobiographical, it's autophotography, but it's recreated and constructed rather than images being generated as I experienced the illness, if that makes sense. So these are a couple of examples which, where I'm seeking to show, I suppose, or create some intrigue around the dialogue that there might be using diptychs. So in the first image here, you can actually see that I appear to be a strong, powerful individual. That's how I see myself in that particular image. And then I'm juxtaposing it with a picture of the skeletal image of my neck fixation. So that's the titanium fixture that basically now props up or has propped up my head for the last 13 years. And I suppose when I looked at those and I generated them, it was this question of physical strength and mental strength. And this this basic continual battle that there is between looking, how you look on the surface versus about how you might feel below the surface. The second image here, I was kind of dealing with this whole sense of tension and this idea of you wanting to close things off, which is what a scar seems to do to protect the body and to heal it. But the juxtaposition with the tree bark is this idea of this continuous strain that it's got to break open. It looks like it could burst at any particular moment in time. And these particular sets of images were really generated out of my thoughts around the sense of presence and non-presence, the consciousness and lack of focus that I had after being diagnosed. When you're told that you have this illness, you get this huge flow and influx of new information, new terminology, new data. You go on the internet and you search for things. They tell you that you've got 3 to 5 years to live, and all this information is rushing in at you, and everything becomes clear and unclear. So these images are the ones that came, or that evoked in me when I thought about that particular experience that I had. This is really a panel of 10 images that I generated, and it captures, for me at least, the real sense of the emotional roller coaster that I went on. I have given a couple of examples of bigger examples of it. So the one to the left here was really to evoke this idea that now I was trapped. Someone had told me something, that I was ill. So in the confines of my brain, I no longer had the freedom that I previously had. It was now fixed. The neck was fixed. My world was upside down. I was, in a sense, constricted by this framework. And it wasn't only a physical framework, it was a psychological framework that I started to build, I suppose, at that moment in time. And then the middle picture is this idea of being elephantine, this sense that you're now a scarred individual, even though the scars on the back of my neck, and most of it is hidden by hair or by a shirt, you still have the sense that everybody's looking at you, that you are now damaged, that you are now no longer the perfect individual that you thought that you were up until that point. This happened, remember, when I was 39 years old. And then the third image is this sense of course, you're still absorbing all this information and people are telling you, but actually I was ashamed to tell people that I was ill. I was running a business. I looked after 72 people. It was a big company. I only told 3 of those people directly. I didn't tell people that I was ill, and I closed down, shut my mouth, closed my ears, and I went on and just got on with the treatment. And of course, below the surface, there was all of this anger and this rage that was there. You ask questions such as why and how and what does it mean, what will happen. And then the middle image is this sense of, or for me at least, it conveys the sense of drowning in cancer. So, the bone had lesions. It could have fractured, in different places. It could, of course, metastasize and move. So I had this sense that I was just being pulled under by the illness. And obviously a couple of days before, I thought I was healthy and getting ready for my 40th birthday party, if that makes sense. And the third image there is just an outline of, I suppose, the physical scar, just to give you a sense of what it looks like. So I'll move on fairly quickly. Then I started to create some panels which question things around the consequences. So would my partner then become, or would I become dependent on my partner? I'd never really felt that sense of dependency before. It scared me that would be the case. I had a dialogue with my skeletal self. I had a dialogue with my, angry, burning self. I had this sense of, was I going to disappear? Was life or was death just going to come and kind of roll over and take me away? And here where I found that images couldn't work, these are mostly drawings or altered images. I wanted to give a sense to people what the causes might be. So was it the tumor? Was it genetics? Was it the lesions in the bones? Was it me prematurely aging, etc.? So just to give a sense of context, I suppose these images provide, I hope. And these ones, although they're very small, and I apologize for that, they look at things such as the stem cell transplant, where this is my life draining away. This is the new life coming through into the system. This is a skyline of needles that are etchings that I generated using software. And then this one here is actually the death of the old Martin and the rise of the new one. The idea being that the same face is in every image, because on the surface everything seemed to be still the same, but yet everything had changed below the surface, if that makes sense. Of course, when you experience new things, and particularly things that are medically orientated, where drugs are involved, you don't only get the sense of hyper awareness, and you also get the sense of surreal things happening. So I started to play with things such as the surgical tights, and the sense of the mask hiding me away, or feeling, very bizarre. So this is a sequence that I generated, which kind of just plays with this idea to bring I suppose, a sense of lightness to what might otherwise be quite a heavy subject. The biggest challenge, of course, was really working out that I wasn't as strong an individual as I thought I was, both mentally and physically. So I used historic references such as the Roth to give this sense of how I might be feeling below the surface. One second. And then these are dialogues. So there are dialogues that I've had with a healthy and an ill self. A dialogue that I was having around whether heaven or existed, and if that was a path I was going to take. I hadn't been religious up until that point, but a lot of people find religion in times like this, but I chose not to. And then the third image on the right is this sense of confinement and the restlessness that there is with being confined. For example, on the 14 days where I had my stem cell transplant, or for the 2 months really when I was home convalescing after everything had kind of happened. This is the sequence that's actually up in the Belfast Exposed gallery, and when I generated this, obviously, in retrospect. So it was created in the last 3 months, but it seeks to highlight, I suppose, the sense of desperation and the sense of bewilderment and the sense of despair that I had when experiencing the trauma. And then I only cried twice. Was interesting to me. I fixated on that as the title, but I then questioned why I had to say that. What was it, my masculinity, or a dent to my masculinity, that I had to quantify how few times I cried, if that makes sense. So this is a picture which I suppose is highlighting my vulnerability and questioning, I suppose, masculinity in my context. So my influences were Joe Spence, Hannah Wilkie, Christina Nunes. As I said already, the approach was phototherapy, autopathography. John Copeland's and Francis Bacon are huge influences for me. My sequences are influenced by people like Francesca Woodman and Dwayne Michaels. And then, of course, for my academic work, I've looked at Rosie Martin, Weiser, and Rosenthal. But although most of those are looking at phototherapy from a clinical perspective, whereas mine is not. It's creative phototherapy, not clinical. So what did I learn? I'm an introvert operating as an extrovert. When stressed and under pressure, I close everybody out and depend on myself. I've got a strong sense of my own strength and worry about how I'm perceived. Strength and development comes from being open, not closed, and sharing is powerful. I'm fallible, fragile, and vulnerable, with a learnt masculinity myth. And what I mean about that is that, we're brought up to as boys in ways to behave and stuff like that. So I reflected on that through all the work that I've done. So how might it develop? Well, hopefully it'll form some part of either a group exhibitions or solo exhibitions going forward. I'm ready to talk about my experiences if people find it valuable. So I've started to look at ways of maybe doing interviews to underpin the work or front the work, if that makes sense. I'm in discussions with companies, with institutions like Bart's Hospital in London to see how we might be able to collaborate, whether that's through them coming in and helping with the book, or through using my work in their visual arts departments and stuff like that. And then I suppose the next stage is to start to consider chapter 1 and chapter 2, because everything I'm doing is in reverse. And then finally, if people want to see any more information, well, those are the links to the various sites. And that is me.
That's great, Martin. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. If anyone has any questions, feel free to speak now. If not, I have a few questions. Maybe we can kind of start a conversation with all of us. I know most of you have kind of touched upon it, no pun intended, with kind of your presentations, which were very thorough, by the way. It's very, very detailed. How was the MFA experience regarding the kind of change or adaptations within your own projects over the course of the MFA? Did you guys expect, I guess, pre-COVID, current COVID, post-COVID, the work that you made, or was there a clear, for me, it's never a clear line, you know, it's never linear, but how was that experience for you all regarding kind of that, and as well as the tutors kind of putting their inputs?
So perhaps I can give, oh, go ahead, Martin.
Paul, go first, it's fine.
Okay. Well, I think one of the great features of this course is how supportive the tutorial staff are. And Donovan and Ken and Alva particularly, and there's others, but those three, they never criticize your work. Well, in my case, they never criticized it, but they always asked questions that would take me to challenge myself and bring more, you know. And through the COVID thing, you know, obviously that's affected all of us in some way or other. But I started my project in Spain, where I lived some of the time, and it was clear after a while I wasn't going to better finish it because I couldn't come to Spain. And so I had to switch very late into the course, and they were so supportive all the time. You know, I think if you hadn't got that level of support from the teaching staff, you could easily ask yourself, you know, is this going to work or not? You know, and really worry about it. But and they said it's normal. They consistently said it's normal. When people come onto the course, they start down a road and then they walk backwards and go down another road. And it happened to at least 3 of us out of the 7 that I was studying with. We just found some better way of doing it with their help.
I think I'd reiterate that, Paul, just on the basis that my project itself didn't change in terms of what I wanted to do, but the way I did it and approached it did. And Paul's right. They never just sat and looked at you and went, "That's crap." But they looked at it and said, and asked questions that made you ask yourself questions. So my approach to my work changed quite a lot over the period. And it's the MFA's particularly taught me to ask myself those questions and ask myself difficult questions. It's also taught me to allow yourself to fail as part of the process. So, you know, you're going through stuff and I'd be producing work and I'd be going, "That's crap," but I didn't know where to go. So, but you'd have these conversations and they empowered you into asking yourself questions about what it was you were trying to achieve, and therefore being able to put that in place. And I think that whole researching, both in terms of other photographers, in terms of whether it's literature or whether it's life or whatever it is that you're bringing into your work, researching around it and asking yourself those questions and continuing to ask those questions all the way through is I think what it's taught me most.
Yeah, I think I actually fortunately, I would say, had decided to change my focus to the trauma experience just before February, around February, and then the COVID lockdown happened. And I'd been struggling to find collaborations for the work that I wanted to do. So in a sense, I was quite fortunate. I think having completed the MFA and being around my cohort and then laterally kind of coming into the online group, I would encourage people to really experiment. So don't take the path of easy following the work that you've previously done. There's a beautiful opportunity to research whatever you want. And I think Donovan said something great, which was, if you find yourself researching something and it's hard, you're not interested, move on. That you find something that really excites you from an academic research perspective, and then incorporate that into your work. So that was kind of a lesson. So I used to change my approach every quarter for the first 6 quarters, because I just wanted to try things, to learn things, to do stuff different. And then going back to what Claire said, sometimes the work that you had produced that you thought wasn't relevant or was no good, it would come back out into the iteration, and suddenly in the context of some other piece would become very, very powerful. At least that was my experience.
Yeah, the other thing I'd say, Ben, is that you start off with this. The course is really in 2 halves. There's the practical work and there's the dissertation. And at the beginning, it wasn't clear to me how the dissertation related to my practical work. And I would get very worried about it. I'd say, well, what do you want me to write about? You know, what's acceptable? And they just said, just think outside of the box, you know. And guess what? After 2 years, I ended up writing about baby boomers, you know, and it just sort of, the two of them, you could look at my dissertation and my practice, and it's the same thing. And I think everybody I've spoken to on the course, the same thing happened to them.
And they do prepare that quite well, don't they, Paul, with the way they get you to do sort of the build-up of the work before the dissertation in terms of the academic side of it and the different, so for each semester, the bit of work you had to produce led you a bit further down the path, so that by the time you got to the dissertation, you did have some idea what you were doing.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Absolutely. It's very much about experimenting and pushing the boundaries. And I think this show really does, not to be biased, but it does really push those boundaries within the kind of contemporary photography sphere. There's just another question from Monique. Thanks for the presentation. Hope all is well. It's Nick here typing. Oh, so hi, Nick. Just wondered if you're in your black and white Descent and Rise series, you had also maybe seen the work of Gareth Arendt as well as Doneen Michaels. Just curious. So maybe if you've heard of those works. If not, that's future reference. Thanks, Nick and Monique. Yeah, just touching upon that kind of experimentation, kind of pushing the boundaries within the kind of the work you guys do. I noticed, you know, the use of construction, the kind of the staged image is very apparent to certain degrees in all of your works. Do you think about that a lot in terms of your process and your methodology when you approach something in terms of this kind of construction, as kind of the more tutors in the photography course are more, you know, there's kind of this debate with pure photography and kind of what does that mean in the landscape, you know, any thoughts on that in terms of the kind of constructing that? Because Paul, you know, you used these kind of lavish sets. I presume, kind of what was the process for you in that?
Well, I was quite influenced by, you know, a number of photographers, Tina Barney, for example, Larry Sultan, you know, who photographed his parents towards the end of their lives. And I also love Gregory Crutzen. I love the way he creates these cinematic images, you know, with great lighting. but actually it's quite difficult. It's nerve-wracking to take pictures of your friends and family. They're not sure what you're trying to get from them. So initially, probably the first 20 shots you throw away because they're smiling, and you have to keep saying to them, look, just, I don't want your gaze in the picture. Most of my pictures, I don't have a gaze from the subject into the camera because that just wouldn't work for what I'm trying to do. And so, but they're nervous, and that makes you nervous. And you know, we've heard famous photographers talk about how you get people to relax when you're doing portraiture. It's very difficult. It's really difficult. And because I had to take pictures during lockdown so I'd have to go and get a COVID test the day before I went into their house to make them feel at ease. You know, and sometimes I probably broke a few rules, but and then lighting as well. You know, if you go into a friend's house with a ton of lighting, that's going to scare the hell out of them. So you can't really do that. You've got to rely on, you know, natural light, a bit of flash rebounding off the ceiling here and there. But I found it quite difficult, much harder than I thought. You know, and I came from an environment a bit like Claire, you know, where I was used to street photography, where I just walk up to somebody and take a picture, steal a picture, and walk on. You know, so yeah, I learned a lot about lighting. Getting people to be themselves, trying to be themselves. And I think most of them do look like they're being themselves in my work. There's a few that perhaps are a bit stiff, but mostly they look relaxed.
I think for me as well, it's about storytelling and what you're trying to say. So for me, whether it's a found image or a constructed image is a bit of a moot point, because for me, it's all about the story and the narrative. So how you get that across is the most important. I don't say with any, you know, sort of some of the images that because I found within my practice, I need to spend a lot of time immersing myself in whatever my subject is. And some of that might be doing nothing. And some of the images will be found images that just show themselves to me and it works. But other times, you know, you're looking at something, you think, oh, it'd be a bit better if it worked like this, or, you know, I need to move that around to get across what I'm trying, you know, like there's the ones with the furniture as it's slowly moving out, and those sorts of things. But it's about trying to get your story across and not about whether it's constructed or not. It's the end product that's the important thing. Unless you're lying about it.
Oh, Martin, you're on mute there, sorry.
I used to do a lot of street photography and candid photography because my view was I wanted to see the scene evolve, and it was almost like you were a director and looking to capture that magic, you know, the decisive moment, if you like, and that was what drove me before. And actually, when I started doing the self-portraiture and doing it, it all had to be reconstructed because it was all coming out of my mind from the past. I actually found it very the process of slowing down, the process of thinking about things in advance, but not thinking about them too much. So there's a real, for me, fine balance between overthinking it and not thinking enough. And actually, I think the best images came out of that kind of still allowing yourself that little bit of freedom, not planning everything and just getting in and experimenting while you were.
Sometimes it changes halfway through, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it should do, you know, because you feel as though things are working or you're getting the right response. And the problem, of course, with doing the self-portraiture is that many times if you move even a half foot in one direction, you're out of focus. But some of those images made it into the cut because they actually evoke something that's much more powerful than a tack sharp image might otherwise present, you know.
I think that's quite exciting as well, Martin, sometimes that you're not quite sure what you're going to get out of it.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, it is. It's fantastic being there by yourself with your little clicker, remote clicker, and, you know, seeing what you'll get, you know.
Absolutely. There's another quick question for you, Martin, by Helena Lee. She was wondering, during your presentation, there was paper sizes next to some of the images. Was that just kind of logistics, kind of pragmatics, or could you maybe elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, well spotted, and I apologize for that. I lifted those from the exhibition guide that I've, the panel sequences from an exhibition guide. So they just give a sense of how, if I in my dream world, if this was being exhibited, what size the panels would be and what size and how they would be presented, if that makes sense. So the A4, A5, A3s, etc., are just, they were lifted from a document that I used. So no reason other than bad or laziness on my behalf in pulling that presentation together. So, but well spotted.
Yes, thank you for that. This is some of the install shots from the current show that we have on at the gallery at the moment. Would it be maybe interesting for each of the artists maybe to talk about maybe the kind of edits, or kind of what, as Martin and well, as the rest of the artists, you know, there was quite an extensive body of work that was made for your MFA. You know, how was the kind of negotiations with ourselves in the gallery, or how did you kind of envision your work in the space, or with the kind of current work that's on here? How was that process for you?
It was brilliant. So I used John Rush, the printer in Belfast, who printed these for me. Those two images there are 1 meter wide, and they're dye bond mounted. So there's no frame, there's no other mount. And so the other two on the right, but they're 1/2 meter wide as well. And so I asked for that space and I got it. And Deirdre was fantastic. Everybody at BX is amazing. They said, "What do you want to put on the wall?" And I said, well, "That's what I'd like to put." I guess the logistics of getting the stuff printed remotely. For half of our MFA course was remote and half was on campus. So I'm in the remote distance learning group. So in London, it was a bit of a worry getting them printed remotely. So you had to be very careful getting the right ICC files from the printer to match your screen so that the color came out exactly as you expected it. But in the end, it was a perfect process for me. So I was very happy with it. Yeah. And it's difficult to show, in a gallery, a whole project. So the selection of which pieces work. I mean, those two there might be interesting to know about this, going back to one of your other questions about, what was it like on the course and how did you alter? These two pictures were taken on a day when I was very depressed. So I went down to the River Thames. I was stuck on my project and I had my rangefinder with me and I took two pictures of this guy and I was just, I felt like a tourist. And I came back, put them on the computer and put them next to each other. I thought, that works, that's a square. That works really nicely. And they're probably my best two pictures on my course. So, I don't know who it was that said it, but you don't make any pictures unless you get out with your camera and press the shutter. And so that's a good lesson for me. I try and take a camera with me all the time now and just take lots of pictures because you accidentally stumble across some of them.
I don't know about you, Martin, because I think you were saying to me, I had so many pictures to work with. I spent 2 years photographing this space pretty much, whilst eventually then clearing it down. And there's, sort of editing it down to a really tight edit was actually quite hard. And I think it's one of those things, it's quite an emotional subject for me. So even looking at the pictures, trying to detach myself from from some of the emotion in some of the images, because it's bringing back memories or thoughts that are going to be completely irrelevant to anybody else and probably don't always fit with the project. Yeah. So it's trying to edit that down. So basically what I did is I printed out all the images onto little tiny sort of 3-inch by 2-inch pieces, and I just literally covered my dining table for about 3 weeks, and every so often I'd walk past it. I should have stuck them on the wall really, but I didn't have any wall space, and I'd just I'd just come and have a look at them as I walked past. It's like, no, that one doesn't fit, and I'd take things out and put them back in, and I found that sort of one of the easiest ways to do it over a period of time rather than trying to do it in a really compressed time frame.
Yeah, I found the challenge I had was that, like yourself, Claire, I produced a lot of images, and I think even at the stage where we were talking about with Deirdre, I was still editing down at that particular point. And I suppose because it was a group show, there's a challenge which was you can never get everything that you want into it. And I think had my work gone over into some of the other images, they wouldn't have necessarily sat that comfortably with the sequence that was actually selected. So I suppose, like everybody else, they see what they had exhibited as an entry point into their work, into a body of work, and hope that there's enough intrigue in that set of images or that sequence which the viewer will want to go further and find out, okay, what else is in that body of work, and what else has that artist or photographer generated. So, you know, I actually I love the hanging of the sequence, and actually, Claire, I think it sits very nicely next to yours as well, and Gavin's is to the right of it, which looks superb too. So yeah, I was very happy with the results.
And I think that's the other challenge, isn't it, Martin, with a group show, because it's not just how your work sits on the wall, it's got to fit with the other projects around it as well.
Exactly. So I loved the whole installation when I went in. It was great to see it all on the wall.
Yeah, it was quite a refreshing exhibition, just coming out of, I guess, COVID. I think for myself as well, it was definitely needed to see some physical imagery on a wall. I think we can all agree with that.
Yeah.
So that is just a little taster of what we have in the gallery at the moment. As I said, it runs to the 17th of July. And if anyone has any other questions, please feel free to say now. Or if not, I think that concludes our artist talk. I just want to give a massive thank you to each individual artist, Claire, Paul, and Martin. Thank you so much. You've been great this evening. I hope you enjoyed it as well. As the artists have said, their social media handles and everything are on our website, belfastexposed.org, as well as Instagram as well. And you can kind of keep up to date with other exciting projects they have in the coming year. But it's been great to work with you all.